On cue. Welcome everyone to the joint NREL, Northern Central Climate Science Center and Ecosystem Science and Sustainability Department seminar, fall seminar. The sort of thematic topic for this semester seminar is called Managing for Climate Change. And we have a group of researchers that are coming in from CSU, from other universities around the nation, and actually one internationally, which will be coming in next week, providing their insights. And today we have both Lori Peak and Carlie Trott here to co-present. And it's really useful to look at this interface between what we're seeing in environmental changes that are taking place around the world and the sort of the social science interface with that. And so having Lori from the Sociology department and Carlie from the Psychology department here on campus presenting their research on these underrepresented communities is really wonderful for us to see that research and that sort of perspective, because it really helps us then in the work that we do in more of the biophysical, socio-ecological system, really understand this interface. So it's really a great opportunity to have Lori here, in particular, who's professor in the Department of Sociology, as I mentioned, but she's also co-director of the Center for Disaster and Risk Analysis here, and an author of a number of books that you'll see in her bio that she's provided. But it's really, a really wonderful expertise that she's brought. And then Carlie, in the Department of Psychology, research assistant here, again, in the same Center for Disaster Risk Analysis, and also working just down the hall here in the STEP program, with looking at this educational interface with science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So we're going to co-present, and I'll turn it over to Lori.
It took a while to come up before. Okay, good. Nice. Hi, everybody, and thank you for being here today. I always feel like it's somewhat of a miracle when people show up for things like this on Fridays on perfect Colorado days. And so really, thanks a lot for dragging yourselves from outside if you're out there in here. And I am, again, as Dennis said, I'm Lori Peak, and I'm a sociologist here at Colorado State University. And I am really proud today to be assuming the role as warm-up act for who I think is really going to be the star today, which is Carlie Trott, who is soon to be defending her dissertation in the Department of Psychology, and I am really honored to be one of her committee members. And so how we've sort of organized this presentation today is that Dennis, as he said, he invited us in as social and behavioral scientists to sort of try to offer a perspective of how do we, sometimes on the other side of campus, how do we think about climate change, and how do we think about disasters, and how do we think about vulnerability? I do a lot of work with engineers, and one of the first things we learned when we started sitting down in the rooms together is, like, when I would use the word vulnerability, I was thinking about low-income and marginalized populations and people that don't have a voice during non-disaster times. And when engineers were using the word vulnerability, they were talking about buildings that fall down when the earth shakes or when the wind blows. And so it is really important to think about, how do we use these words, where do they come from, and so forth. And so we're going to start today at sort of like the 30,000 foot level with, again, as Dennis asked, sort of offering a theoretical perspective with how do social scientists engage with these questions about disasters and climate change. And then we're going to zoom down on the ground, literally on the ground all around us. And Carlie is going to share this incredible intervention that she has actually developed, where she has been working with children in Larimer County in order to implement a climate change education program. So without further ado, so we can get through what I'm going to say and get to the main act. So as we know, disasters, in particular climatological disasters, are the main symptom that people seem to be looking at when we talk about a sick planet from climate change. And over the past several decades, as scientists have been tracking what has been happening with so-called natural disaster events all across the globe, one of the patterns that is most apparent is that while so-called geophysical events have remained relatively consistent across time in terms of number of events, we have seen a dramatic rise in the number of meteorological events, hydrological events, as well as climatological events across time and space. And one of the things that I think as a sociologist that is really important to engage with is this idea that disasters are equal opportunity events, because we think so much about the disaster agent when we're looking at this, and we think, what is causing the disaster? And then a lot of times there's sort of this tendency historically in disaster research, for example, where the earliest people who started studying natural disasters, they would write about these events as acts of God, acts of nature that, quote, affected all populations equally. In fact, some of the earliest people who were writing in this space, they called disasters the great equalizers. And they said that these are events that they affect everyone the same. And I think with climate change being an event that is being a global phenomenon, there is a similar tendency in today's language to talk about this as something that is going to affect our whole planet, that could potentially be catastrophic on a scale that is something we can't envision. But the issue with that sort of totalizing language is what it obscures is that climate change and climate-related disasters are already affecting populations who are situated differentially across our planet. And so 2 decades ago, some of the earliest people who started to work from social vulnerability to disasters perspective, they argued this in this classic work, At Risk. The crucial point about understanding why disasters happen is that it is not only about the natural events that cause them. They are also the product of social, political, and economic environments. And there is a real danger in treating disasters as something peculiar, as as events that deserve their own special focus, again, outside of these social, political, economic, and natural systems. And so in that At-Risk book, again, responding to Dennis's request to sort of offer a theoretical framework for how do we think about the social roots of risk or the social causes of disaster, this is one pretty widely used theoretical framework in the social science study of disasters. And so this framework begins with asking us to think about the natural environment and how across the natural environment hazards and exposure to hazards as well as amenities is spatially varied. And so in this model of the social causation of disasters, it recognizes that there are indeed different agents that cause disasters. And there are also different, what Wisner and colleagues refer to as opportunities, locations, and resources for human activities that are also spatially varied. And then this model goes on to argue that it's ultimately social processes, social, economic, political processes that determine this unequal access. Across our globe, we obviously don't have equal distribution of either exposure to hazards events or access to the so-called good things in life or amenities and opportunities. And some of the social forces and factors that have been most of interest and most studied have been how do demographic differences related to class, ethnicity, age, disability, immigration status, and so forth, how do those factors intersect with how do they shape our social systems, our power relations, and ultimately how are they connected to broader political and economic processes at national and international scales. And so this is sort of one big theoretical framework. In the social science study of disasters and of vulnerability, a lot of the work that is out there in today's scholarship really sort of focuses on trying to understand how do these demographic characteristics, how did these particular groups, marginalized groups, how did they then end up being affected disproportionately in disaster? And so this leads to the Wisner et al. They also developed this, what they call a pressure and release model. And so they argue that marginalized populations, at the end of the day, we know that marginalized populations end up suffering disproportionate loss of life, disproportionate injury in disaster. They end up having disproportionate health issues related to long-term recovery of disaster and so forth. And so this model goes on to try to understand what are the root causes that put people at differential risk to these events. And so they start with what they refer to as the root causes. And so marginalized groups tend to have limited access to key resources, to power, to structures of opportunity within political and economic systems. Then we also know that these root causes, they're in no way static, that they're what they refer to as these dynamic pressures that then occur within systems. And so everything from oftentimes marginalized populations, they lack certain things within our social and economic systems. And then there are also these broader forces that unfold in social life. And then the third part of their pressure and release model has to do with this idea of unsafe conditions and how unsafe conditions intersect across our physical environment. So where do people live? Who lives in the most dangerous or risky spaces? What do people's local and national economies look like? What do social relations look like, and how are public actions and institutions either preparing for or not preparing for responding to special risks? And so Wisner and colleagues refer to this as the progression of vulnerability or the mounting of vulnerability. And as particular population groups, if you think of this as cumulative, as they accumulate more and more of the so-called risk over time and space, and then as they're exposed to different types of hazards events, that's when we see these disasters unfold in our world. And so there's been a lot of effort in the United States to try to map and to try to identify where are the most vulnerable populations living. And so this is a model that Susan Cutter and her colleagues at the University of South Carolina have put together, where they've used US Census data in combination with natural hazards data to try to get at this intersection between exposure to hazards and then socio-demographic risk. And this is a mapping of showing that the persons who have been deemed most socially vulnerable, so low-income populations, single mother-headed households, racial and ethnic minorities, and so forth. This is at the county level, the red boxes showing the counties that have deemed it having high risk, white, medium risk, and low, the bottom 20%. And so just a few words on, again, those groups that have been deemed most vulnerable to climate change, related disasters. And so when we start diving deeply again and thinking about how are these events not equal opportunity events, we can see across a number of events how there have been disproportionate effects on different groups. Save the Children has released several reports where they have shown in terms of climatological events worldwide that children make up people under the age of 18 make up over 50% of those who have been most affected by climate change related disasters. We know that the elderly persons over the age of 55 or 65, depending on which definition is being used, suffered disproportionate loss of life and injury in weather-related deaths. And this is especially apparent in both weather extremes in terms of extreme cold weather and extreme heat weather. Women are also at disproportionate risk, especially in developing countries. Consider that in 1991, when Bangladesh was hit by a deadly cyclone that killed about 140,000 people, best estimates say that about 90,000 people, or 90% of those 140,000 people who died were women. And that doesn't have anything to do with the biological fact of being a woman. It has to do with how women are differentially situated within society. And so we know that women and girls were far less likely to know how to swim, for example. Even though there have been many interventions since that terrible loss of life that occurred in 91 to try to teach women and girls how to swim, when you look at the death toll in the 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami, it's estimated, the World Health Organization estimates that about 77% of the people that died in the tsunami in 2004 were women and girls. And so again, trying to see ongoing differential effects of these events. In terms of racial and ethnic minorities in the United States, there's been increasing momentum writing around trying to figure out how are racial and ethnic minorities at differential risks. So we know in the United States today, African Americans emit about 20% less they have about 20% less emissions than their non-Hispanic white counterparts, but African Americans are somewhere between 150% to 200% more likely to die from heat-related deaths in the United States today. And so again, this sort of language that we think about who is least responsible for these changes in the climate, but who is already bearing the disproportionate burden or effects of these events. And why do African Americans have this much higher rate of death in heat-related hazards? Again, it has nothing to do with being Black, with having Black skin. It has to do with ways that African Americans are disproportionately situated within the society. So African Americans are far more likely to live in urban settings in the United States. They're far less likely to have access to cooling centers and to regular access to air conditioning, for example. And then they're more subject to this, what people write about as the urban heat island effect. So again, it's that intersection of how are people situated in our society and how do political, economic, and social systems react. We also know that Indigenous populations, and Shannon McNeely is here and is an expert in this space, they have been receiving increased attention as well and trying to understand how, where are Native communities in the United States and what is going on when they either have too much water or too little water, and what is the response going to be. Persons with disabilities globally, something like about 20% of people around the globe have some kind of physical disability or other form of disability, and persons with disabilities are also disproportionately affected. And also the economically disadvantaged. Some reports have argued that of all the people that actually die in disasters around the world, some 94% of them would be considered poor or low-income populations. And so we're going to transition to Carlie right now. And so then the big question becomes, so what are the responses in terms of, we know there's study after study after study that has documented these disproportionate effects for marginalized populations. And so there has been more and more discussion about how do we work with vulnerable communities to try to figure out how are we going to respond to climate change and to these weather-related disasters. And so there's a lot of discourse right now about population relocation. Our entire community is going to actually move, and they're going to retreat from the coastlines, or they're going to retreat from rural areas where they don't have enough water. There is also a lot of discussion about technological fixes. And so everything from putting more cooling centers in low-income urban areas to try to reduce the number of heat-related deaths to just yesterday, I was with an expert in Japan who was talking about there's an entire city in Japan that they're getting ready. They are literally running, they're taking debris and putting it under the city so they can lift up this entire city to try to respond to what's happening with sea level rise and to mitigate their risk. And so all kinds of technological fixes, also policy change. In the United States today, the Federal Emergency Management Agency now has a tribal liaison for all of the 10 FEMA regions to try to help to get tribal populations to put together climate change mitigation plans, for example. And this is something Shane can talk to us a lot about. Also, lots of direct intervention. So when people figure out why are people dying, trying to do things like teaching women to swim. And then there are also a growing number of locally specific educational outreach programs that are being developed to try to actually engage vulnerable populations. And that's where we're now going to transition to learn from Carlie, who is one of these implementers of a direct intervention and an education program to try to engage children and youth. So thank you, everybody. Thank you. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Carlie Trott. I'm a PhD candidate in applied social psychology here at CSU. The title of my presentation today was inspired by one of the youth that participated in the program that I developed, and so I'll get around to that towards the end of the presentation. So to start off, youth are key stakeholders in efforts to address climate change, though they're often underengaged in both climate change education and forms of socio-political action, and even kind of day-to-day behavior changes that could be thought to reduce our contributions to climate change. They're also understudied when it comes to their climate change engagement. So while there's this whole, large and growing social science literature on climate change engagement that focuses on cognitions and behaviors and attitudes among adults, we know very little about how youth connect to climate change. Youth are particularly understudied as agents of sustainable change within their families and communities. So there are a number of barriers to youth participation in climate change. On the one hand, there are educational barriers, where we know that there's no standardized curriculum for teaching climate change in the classroom. A recent report came out from the National Center for Science Education, which was called Mixed Messages. And that report talked about how a quarter of teachers that are teaching about climate change in the classroom are dedicating about equal time to teaching both sides of the so-called debate around climate change. We also know that teachers can be undertrained or underprepared to be teaching climate change in the classroom, and that this can relate to, say, when they went to college, when they were trained to be teachers. And but for the most part, teachers aren't spending much time teaching about climate change at all. I think the report said that on average, teachers were spending maybe an hour in total teaching about climate change. There's also social and cultural barriers to youth participation in climate change. So this relates to some of the dominant narratives or culturally entrenched kind of constructions about childhood and youth in society. What do we think about kids in society? What is their role? What do we expect them to do? And typically what we think of is that childhood and youth is a period of preparation and socialization for the full citizenship of adulthood. And this, of course, relates to political barriers. This idea that politics is an adult-only sphere. And so kind of tying this all back together, climate change as a politicized issue can be considered controversial and therefore maybe unsuitable for the classroom. There's a number of rationales for engaging youth in climate change as well. And this includes the moral and the ethical. The idea that, of course, today's youth will be facing the impacts of
climate change tomorrow. So therefore, it's only fair to be engaging them on this issue now. And then there's the practical, the idea that today's youth are tomorrow's climate change decision makers and leaders that will also be facing climate change impacts. And so it only makes practical sense to be preparing them and to be engaging them on this issue now. So my dissertation project took both of these problems as its starting point. The first being youth as understudied, where their perspectives and actions are often overlooked relative to broader social science literature, where the existing studies are primarily pedagogical. So despite the educational landscape, the studies that exist that link youth and climate change are typically looking at how do we best teach the science of climate change in the classroom for the best learning outcomes. And then there's also a few studies of youth climate change action. So while there are studies that talk to young people about maybe engagement in climate change activism, these are typically with young people that are high school age or above. So even youth is even a word that's used to describe college students, for example. So not a lot is known about younger people and how they engage in climate action. And then, of course, the second problem being that youth are underengaged. So my dissertation had a dual focus: to understand how youth are navigating, connecting to, approaching, taking action on the issue of climate change through a program that sought to facilitate their engagement using participatory methods. So my community partner was the Boys and Girls Clubs in Northern Colorado. There were 55 youth that participated in the program across 3 separate Boys and Girls Club sites. They were ages 10 to 12, which is roughly 4th to 6th grade, about half and half boys and girls. And the Boys and Girls Club serves a low-income community, but that doesn't necessarily describe all of their members. And so in this study, of the 55 youth, about 42% were below the poverty threshold. And then in terms of participant ethnicity, we had 56% white youth, followed by about a quarter of the youth were Hispanic or Latino, and then 15% described multiple ethnicities. So here is the representation there. So certainly in terms of some of these dimensions that Lori was talking about in terms of vulnerability, this is a young population, more than half girls and many youth of color. So this was a 16-week after-school program that I designed that combined climate change education with participatory action through photo voice methodology, and I'll describe each of those. The program itself came to be called Science Camera Action. Science Camera Action describes the primary components of the program. So science were the educational activities that the kids engaged in. Camera was the photo voice process where everybody got a digital camera. And then finally, both of those components culminated in youth-designed action projects in a couple of ways. So the science activities were problem-focused or solutions-focused. So in the beginning, we talked about things like, for example, the interconnectedness of the natural world. We talked about the greenhouse effect. What does that mean? We also talked about the impact of climate change on ecosystems. And we moved into sustainable solutions. So what can we do in our own personal lives, as well as what can we do collaboratively within communities? What a voice process was where every kid was given a digital camera. And this process was paired with the science educational activities. And so I would ask the youth to take their cameras and think about what we did for our science activity, what the big idea was of that week, and to take photos that of things that remind them of the activities that we did. So what did this make you think about? How did this make you feel? Take a few photos of these ideas. And for research purposes, of course, photos and narratives and some of the audio recordings that I have of our discussions will help me to understand, you know, the ways that youth were connecting to this issue. But in terms of the program, this process of photo voice allowed them to maybe see the concreteness in some of these abstract science concepts. And it also helped to make these topics maybe a little bit more personally relevant. And so these photos then kind of inspired our action projects. So youth action projects took place in a couple of ways. First were family action plans. How could we reduce our impact on the environment through changes to our daily habits or our lifestyle kind of choices? And second, in terms of collaborative action projects. So this is what we did at the very end of the program. So I'd like to just go over briefly what these action projects ended up looking like. So the family action plans, this was a site-based competition. So each of the 3 research sites were designing ways that they could reduce their own, influence their family members and friends and others to lower their carbon footprints. So so everybody kind of won for 2nd and 3rd place. They all got different levels of prizes, but all told, afterwards, using a carbon calculator, the group saved 1.1 metric tons of CO2 from the atmosphere, which is roughly equivalent to 2,500 miles driven by passenger vehicle or 28 tree seedlings growing for 10 years. Pretty impressive. The first collaborative action project with the smallest group in the smallest town decided that they wanted to design and deliver a town meeting presentation. So to press their local city officials to take leadership and action on climate change. Their presentation was called Climate Change, in all caps, Operation Do Something. So, and so I think what made it a little bit easier, I suppose, is at the end of the presentation, they asked if they were allowed to plant trees in public parks in the area. And so they were given approval for that. There were about 60 community members in the audience that day, and the presentation was overall really well received. The town leaders kind of commended them for what they were doing and taking leadership themselves, and the community members gave them a warm round of applause, which was good. So anyways, so they've planted 12 trees so far, some on private property, and then a couple of larger trees in parks. So the second kind of middle-sized group that I worked with decided to go more the technology route. So and this is a typical outcome of photo voice methodology, where you take photos of the problems that you see around you in your community, and you have a photo gallery opening, and you talk to community members or policymakers, leaders, and you try to address those problems. In this case, the youth decided that they wanted to pick out some of their favorite photos and to talk to family members and community members at an open house kind of after hours family night at the Boys and Girls Clubs. So they picked out their favorite photos, we matted them, they picked out some titles and some captions, and talked to the community about what their photos meant and what we can all do about it. And this event also doubled as kind of an unveiling for their second action project, which was to create a website. To create a website about the program and to talk about what they learned and maybe how you can get involved too. And then the third group decided that they wanted to revive a disused garden space that was right outside of their Boys and Girls Club. So as you can see beforehand, it was pretty overgrown, but it had been a garden. And afterwards, we had planted more than 100 fruits and vegetables. And most recently, they've been harvesting the garden. This only ended in May, so this is happening now. And they're using some of these foods to teach kind of educational activities and eating at the clubs. So again, this is my dissertation. So I have multiple types of data to go through and to answer some research questions. But today I'm going to talk mostly about evaluating the program impacts and using the survey data that I have. So I'm going to go over environmental knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors, and then just a bit on their attitudes about science. The first before the program, I asked them, how much do you think you know about climate change? And beforehand, they were pretty all over the place. Again, this is self-estimated knowledge. So, you know, what do you think you know? And then after the program, they felt like they knew quite a bit more. But we'll get to an actual knowledge assessment here in a moment. Before the program, I asked them how much they had thought about climate change before today. And here again, they were kind of all over the place. But you can see this proportion over here that's thinking about it some or a lot, which kind of adds an emphasis to the idea of maybe engaging youth a little bit earlier than they would be in school, for example. And of course, you know, as we would expect after the program, they were thinking about climate change. And then just kind of some general perceptions about what they think about climate change. I asked them to respond to a false. Earth's climate is changing now, and you can see we kind of know that it's happening now. I mean, they were at least partially that was happening, and after the program, they became more sure about it. So here's some tests that I was able to do, and I just want to preface this by saying that there is no control group in the study, so we can't be 100% sure that any changes are related to the impact of this program, but we hope that it had these impacts. So here we have a 14-item knowledge assessment about climate change. And this covered this climate system, some causes and consequences of climate change. So what are the consequences? Climate change will cause some places to get wetter, others drier, or action to address climate change. So some of the social dimensions, what can people do to make a difference on this problem? And you can see that the top. Sorry. Okay, I was gonna use the laser, but anyway, we can see here on the slide under pre that that's a percentage, by the way. So that was 60% that they were getting, you know, before the program. That it went up about 8 points after the program. This was a statistically significant difference, and in psychology, this is effect size, Cohen's d. That's somewhere between a middle and a large effect size. Environmentally responsible attitudes. This is a 6-item scale that has items like my actions impact the health of the environment, or I have the power to help the environment. And we can see here under pre that on a 5-point scale from 1 to 5, where 5 is strongly agree, they were starting out with some pretty environmentally responsible attitudes, but somehow we managed to significantly improve on those. So again, pretty impressive. Third, we have kind of some real day-to-day environmental behaviors as well as stewardship attitudes. So these are items like, I feel like it's important to take good care of the environment, or I'm careful to not waste water or to food. And again, we started out pretty friendly on those things, got even better to a statistically significant degree. And then finally, the carbon footprint contest lasted about 5 weeks in the middle of the 16-week program. And just to assess the carbon footprint to begin with, and after and following the behavior change, there were 20 items asking questions like how often do you turn off a light when you leave the room, all the way to how many days per week do you eat meat or use a reusable as opposed to a disposable water bottle, those kinds of things. So even though these items were kind of on Likert type or numeric scales, they were transformed into pounds of CO2 equivalent, and that is what this line here shows is average carbon footprints, not in relation to these behaviors, and then aggregated into a year-long scale. And we found that that did go down on average for the kids over just that month-long period. In terms of science attitudes, I'm interested in just the impact of this program on, did kids think about science in school or science careers? This program engages kids that are underrepresented, from underrepresented groups in science. So youth of color, girls, and economically disadvantaged. And so attitudes towards school science had items like learning things in science lessons, science lessons.
The other one was on a different
And you can see that these also, again, the kids were pretty excited about science before the program started. And of course, this club was not compulsory. So joining Science Camera Action, kids who might have already liked science wanted to join the club called Science Camera Action. But somehow we did get to improve upon their attitudes towards science, even still. Attitudes towards careers in science. Items like working in a laboratory would be interesting, or I would like being a scientist after I leave school. And these also significantly improved following the program.
Okay, this is the right one. Yeah, so these two laptops and that monitor.
You want two laptops like this? Yep. The group what they would like to do when they grow up, and by far and away the.
So you want two systems like this and one monitor.
Large career category of all the kids in these places was certainly STEM type careers, which is exciting. And then attitudes towards the societal implications of science. That was just 3 items with statements like science helps make life better. And those also improved. And then finally, I looked at their science grades. And this was the perfect time to look at their science grades because this program started in January following their December, end of term science grades. And then the program ended at the end of May, just as they were getting out of school in the spring. And so I was able to compare their science grades before and after, first on a 10-point scale, and those improved significantly. But I think it's nicer to look at on a 4-point scale. So before the program, most of the kids were getting A's and B's. And after the program, those grades got even better. So that was really nice to see. And just a couple more findings before I finish up here. So I asked them, just in case these scales about science didn't really work out, I asked them, did Science Camera Action help you to like science more? And so many of the kids said that it did. And I asked them why. And this is some qualitative analyses of open-ended survey items. So some of the kids said, now because I know that science can be fun, or I learned interesting new things. Other kids said it's because of these societal or social applications for science that it can help the world. It helped me learn what I can do to help. And then other kids gave, evidence of the fact that it made them like science more. So in terms of school, now I want to be a scientist. And then for those kids who said that it didn't, those were 6 kids. 4 of them said it's because they liked science so much they couldn't add to it. And so the last question I'm really interested in, how does this program help kids feel effective, influential, capable of making a difference in the world? And the vast majority of kids said that this program did help them to feel that way. When I asked him why or why not, some of the kids talked about those sociocultural narratives that I talked about earlier, that they had internalized some of these messages that kids can't do those things. But now they don't feel that way anymore. Some of them talked about feeling informed. Now I know what's going on in the world, so I know what I can do to help. Like, in other words, they had been plugged into this stuff before. And then others just talked about how the program was fun, it made them happy, it made them feel good, and those positive kind of feelings made them feel capable. And then finally, for my one holdout on the pie chart, it's because he already did think that he could. So at least everybody left the program feeling like they could make it in the world. So just some final thoughts. In terms of youth and climate change, we know from some of those baseline earlier charts that youth do have a pre-existing awareness of climate change. We saw that they were almost all at least partially sure that climate change is happening now. And then they ranged in terms of how much they thought about it and how much they think they knew about it. But we also know that, they don't really have a formal outlet for questions that they have. So this program offered a mechanism for finding answers to those questions and maybe allaying concerns or at least motivating them to be more engaged in the issue. In terms of youth climate change engagement, this program was overall really well received. The kids really enjoyed the content. I didn't have any parents calling me, no one was coming after me, and the kids perceived this stuff as really kind of non-threatening. So they understood that climate change is a really big deal and it's a really big problem. But what they wanted to do was to solve it and to do something about it. So the knowledge that they gained throughout the program was very motivating, and the action that they participated in was experienced as empowering. So in this context, just thinking about what are the barriers to youth engagement in climate change, when we think about the broader social psychology or social science literature on climate change, we hear a lot about intrapsychic or cognitive barriers to really thinking about or taking action on climate change. So the best example of this is the psychological literature. Climate change is not happening here. It's not happening to me. It's not happening now. And so it's really easy to feel like that's far away and to just kind of forget about it. With the youth in this study, I was seeing every barrier that stood in the way of them taking positive and meaningful action on climate change as out there. They're not getting it in school. It's a politicized issue. People don't think, kids can make a difference, things like that. But there was nothing inherent about youth that was preventing them from engaging with this topic. Another kind of take home from the study is that climate change education is possible with preteen youth. So typically when they do get climate change in the classroom, it's at the 8th grade level or above. So next generation science standards do include climate change in them. But again, this is 2 to 4 years after the, later on in life than the age group that I was working with. But I think this study also adds emphasis to what the psychology literature will say about engaging people on climate change, and that is learning about it can be really arousing or really motivating of emotions and maybe worries, and that to link that motivation with action is the best way of using that for good. And so in this study, if there was anything that was inherent or universal about the youth that I worked with, it was this really strong desire to help and to save the world. So they saw the problem, they wanted to pitch in about it. So I think really the biggest message of the study is that creating space and opportunities for kids to engage with this topic, to engage actively with this topic is key. And so I'm going to finish up with the sage words of 12-year-old Bill, who took part in my program. And he said, to save the world, you don't need a superpower. All you need is yourself and others to support you. You couldn't have said it better. Thank you.
Became very important in order to maintain our undefeated status, beating up people. They're definitely better for it. They're practicing just for us. I think that a lot of times people come to this game, what shocks them is the level of play. We're crashing at 15 miles an hour. It's not a joke. Some people get seriously injured. Most people learn to ride unicycle because they came and witnessed this event. Like, I've got it. You catch that first ball, see that first rush, you hear the crowd scream your name once, that's a feeling you can't get anywhere else. It's almost like a religion church though here.
Is so select like, I feel it's like a special condition.
Sure, yeah,
Other children has the access or the opportunity to get into this kind of organization, and how many organizations have in the U.S. or in the, so I just wonder how much of the organization have in your research. Do you think about that?
Sure. So as I was developing this program, I did look at other similar programs that might exist. I mean, I would probably use somebody else's model if there were other kind of things that were going out there. I didn't find it. So some programs that teachers are teaching about climate change in the classroom if they have the motivation to do so. I engaged with some through NOAA. I got some funding from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration for this study. And through that kind of was a network of formal science educators, mostly in middle and high school. I'm not sure about other organizations doing similar work, but I will say that my work with the Rose Clubs in particular was really flexible about what I was doing. So I was welcomed and, in fact invited to do a program there that mapped onto some of the science educational programming that they were already doing. And they didn't put any barriers in my way, I should say. So I would imagine that other maybe in schools or other types of organizations, you would end up with kind of maybe different characteristics. But there were also some differences across the three places that I worked with as well. So I was noticing, different levels of staff investment or support could influence how the program was going. And then, of course, the kids had their own way of making the program their own, certainly in terms of the action projects. So does that answer your question?
So do you think this would be expandable to things like 4-H or Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts type activities where, again, groups that are exposed to working in environment, sort of rural activities or gardening and farming?
Absolutely. I mean, one thing that I would say is I think for this model that I had developed for this program, the digital photography was kind of the bridge between science education and making those personal connections, bringing the science down to earth, or at least into our own lives, and making those connections and then funneling that into action. So I feel like there's certainly some lessons that could be learned for 4-H or Boy Scouts or whoever would like to, engage youth on climate change. This model is I think has some potential, certainly with other groups.
Question for Lori. It's interesting to think about the vulnerable community working with, especially at natural hazards. And I guess there's two questions. One is, as we look at sort of the increasing population, another billion people in the next 50 years, are there all indications of increased disproportionate number of vulnerable people as we see population grow in areas where that population is expected to grow? And then is that sort of, if that's so, then how is that being work that you're involved in looking at these underserved, underrepresented communities as we look into, let's say, the 2050 timeframe, where we actually see to really emerge, and then what as society, as various communities or international organizations are looking, what are they doing about that? Don't go away.
I know. Yeah, stay over here because I think there are questions. And so I don't know if people hear the question that Yeah, they can. Okay. So, yeah, so it's a really good question. And I think it gets at one of the big things that I think is happening with this idea of growing population and more people who are going to be at risk to the potential for mass movement away from coastlines, for example, and so forth. So one of the big things that I think is starting to happen in vulnerability science, so like that map that I showed up there of trying to understand like where are vulnerable populations and so forth, that right now a lot of the mapping work that is out there, it's sort of static, right? That it's using like demographic characteristics to try to say this is where a lot of low income people live or a lot of non-English speaking populations in the US and so forth. And I think one of the effects of what you're referring to, Dennis, that one of the good effects in terms of vulnerability science is I think that it's starting to in a much more dynamic way about, so if 10 million people end up being displaced from a particular coastal area in the United States of all different socioeconomic status, what is that going to mean in terms of opportunities? Where are they going to move? And who is going to end up where, and what is it going to mean in receiving communities and so forth? And so that's kind of my one of the thoughts in response to that really good question is just about how people are starting to think differently about not just sort of vulnerability in place, but about vulnerability and how it's connected to this movement that you're referring to. So yeah, thank you.
That a little bit when you're looking at the effect of increasing inequality and vulnerability, as populations become more vulnerable and less vulnerable populations become less vulnerable, how that disparity impacts
Yeah, so that is a really good question. And right, so how are people taking account to sort of rising inequality? Shannon, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. Do you know of anybody that's doing really good work in that particular space? Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, just a personal friend and colleague off the top of my head is Kyle White, who's doing a lot of looking at justice issues. There that does climate justice and hazard work. Natural resource school there.
Bryant?
Huh?
Bryant?
Yeah. Yeah. But I think it is really interesting to think about ongoing divides with sort of, even though there has been some movement with people that are doing, hazards and disaster research, and then there are climate change research, and then there are also really like social inequality research and trying to understand how rises in inequality then translate into all kinds of unequal social and health and behavioral outcomes and so forth. There has been some movement over the last decade, like the National Science Foundation has funded various efforts to try to sort of start to merge what I think are still really stovepipe areas, but people really recognize those interconnections. But as far as kind of bringing them together in these kinds of, in a kind of global model and scale, I think that hopefully is going to be where we keep pushing this in the next 10 years, is moving out of these kind of stovepipes and being able to answer those larger scale questions.
Yes, we're doing together. Some of the efforts within the UN now, and looking at this, the Sustainable Development Goal framework, to where education is really a key aspect. Avoidance of risk and hazards is incorporated in there. The climate sort of reduction in emissions, and looking at food security, poverty reduction, all those sorts of things, and equity issues. So it seems that it's an opportune time to start making these connections and looking at sort of structures. As a university professor, I think our institution structure is so siloed that we don't have the ability to actually start looking at these interfaces. And so thinking about how we might, in our educational system, how would you see directions forward of how to actually provide the academic or research opportunities to really look at these interfaces.
So something that a side answer to that first, and I really wanted to acknowledge about Carlie's work about not just us as academics sort of moving across that, but also when we think about the interventions and the collaborations with vulnerable groups. So Carlie today predominantly focused on her findings with what actually happened with the youth participants. But I think something that is super fascinating about her program is that she also was looking at how are the youth then influencing these sort of spheres of change around them. And so she also has all kinds of data on not just what did this mean for the youth's behavior, but also for their families, which is a big open empirical question, like, because people want to believe like, oh, kids learn things in school and then they go home and change things. And we actually don't really know if that is true or not. And so I think Carlie's work is a big step in terms of like the transmission of science. And so she has data on what did it actually mean for the, what the youth were learning, then how did that translate at the family level? But then she also has data on sort of the community change level. And so I think that's a really important step with the kind of ground up how we're doing education. Is it just sort of at the individual behavior, attitude, knowledge level, or is it also moving into how are we transmitting what we're learning? And Carlie, I don't know if you have a more specific answer to this. That's a really good question.
You know what, I'm just starting to look at some of the data that you're talking about, so I can't really speak to my knowledge about what the sphere of influence really looks like for the kids. But yeah.
Stay tuned.
Yeah, exactly. I'm excited to do it too.
With
Just
that,
a really quick question. Have you
Yeah, they're I say that I got funding from NOAA, but it's that whole community down there that is supporting this work. Yeah. Yeah.
Time's up, so I'm going to thank Laura and Carlie for the presentation. Next week we have a Brazilian scientist coming in to talk about climate responses in Brazil, John Mecco. And so looking forward to seeing you there.
Nice. Thank you. Thanks, Dennis.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, and thanks, Susie. This is such a great group. Thank you for inviting us to this. Yeah.
Perfect. No, really.
The talk actually sounds really fascinating, and it's awesome that you have that web.
Yeah.
I mean, to be able to share this. Yeah. So thank you so much. Thank you.
And we'll send you the link to this if you want to use some of this.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
So I'm taking a class with Ethan Spelling.
Yes. Yeah. Oh my gosh, I know him so well. His wife is one of my best friends.
So in his environmental seminar class,
Yes.
so he wants us to go to presentations and then take a presentation to do a presentation on.
Yes.
So I chose yours. So
Thank you. So I'm Lori. Nice to meet you. Hi.